How did I become interested in swords? That's the question that Paul Bonzalak just emailed me, and it just so happens that I'm in the middle of making videos at the moment, so I thought, what the hell, there's a good question. I guess I've tangentially spoken about this in previous videos, but I think aren't most people who are interested in swords, I think most that I know who are really into it had just kind of, they can't really remember what exactly it was that got them into it. Although I do know some people who will cite a specific film or a specific incident or activity. And for example, I was watching one of Shad's videos earlier, and he noted that Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves was really important on him and making him so interested in the medieval period, and particularly taking up archery as well. And I have another friend of mine, Bob Brooks, runs a series of schools, HEMA schools in the north of England, and I seem to remember him saying that that Star Wars was a big influence on him, and I know that Guy Windsor says that Star Wars was a big influence on him as a kid as well, which is kind of funny when you think about it, because Star Wars, which I'm sure had a huge influence on me, isn't directly a series of films which have swords in them, really. Yes, they've got lightsabers. Are lightsabers swords? Well, in the loosest possible sense. They're sword-like, aren't they? I honestly can't state when it was that I got so massively into kind of, particularly it has to be said, knights and Robin Hood. But I think that it was probably during my holidays from school as a young kid, growing up. A lot of old movies from the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s were shown during the daytime when I was staying at my grandparents' house during particularly, you know, half terms and summer holidays from school, and watching these old movies with you know, Robin Hood movies. It has to be said also other genres as well, like Tarzan. I love Tarzan films, loved the old Johnny Weissmuller Tarzan films, and all of the films that they made, particularly in the 40s and 50s, to do with knights and crusaders and Robin Hood and this kind of stuff, and Arthurian stuff. But it was a bit more than that for me. I honestly have a childhood memory, I must have been 5 or 6 years old, of watching Ben-Hur. You know, the Charlton Heston version, not the remake, which I refuse to accept actually exists, and I haven't watched it, although I'll probably watch it out of curiosity at some point. But you know, watching those kind of what were they called, sword and sandal type epics. So it wasn't specifically focused on the medieval period. I was interested in ancient period and then later. Was I interested in other weapons? Definitely. Although for me, older, more sort of hand weapons and bows and crossbows, you know, primitive missile weapons, personally appealed to me more than firearms. Despite the fact that as an adult I have definitely become interested in firearms, and I do love firearms and I do shoot, for me my first loves will always be swords and probably bows. And so I guess movies played a huge part on me as a child, becoming, and not just movies but also TV series. You know, I remember as a kid things like Robin of Sherwood was on TV. Later as a teenager, I was massively into a series with, I think the actor's called Will or Bill Lyman, and it was called Crossbow, The Legend of William Tell. I know that it was called Crossbow in America and it was called William Tell in the UK, I think for legal reasons. But I got massively into that. But I was already well into sort of medieval stuff by that point. So, you know, by the time I was probably 8 or 9, this was my main interest. Yes, I had other interests as well. I've always been particularly into World War II planes, to a slightly lesser degree World War tanks. I'm not Lloyd's level of tank nerd, but I'm much more into planes. So yeah, I could probably talk a fair amount about World War II planes, but I won't. Yeah, but for me, swords and everything from, whether it was from the Roman era, well, even before that actually, prehistoric era, right the way through to kind of musketeers period, I think. Now, interestingly, I'm probably most known for being into sabres and bayonets in the 19th century history, and I didn't get into that until I was well into my adult years. Yeah, I thought, you know, the Napoleonic Wars and uniforms, I thought they were cool and that kind of stuff, but I never really had any interest in it. And funnily enough, at school until I was 16, I had to learn about the 18th and 19th centuries, and I only wanted to learn about the medieval period, and I wasn't able to study the medieval period properly, academically, until I was 17, and so I did an A-level in medieval history at 17, 18, and I went on to study medieval history at university and archaeology combined, and I was completely obsessed. And it has to be said, actually, so whilst I talk mostly about swords, I was probably even more obsessed as a kid by armour, which of course is one of the reasons I get on very well with Toby Capwell from the Wallace collection, because we can just talk on and on and on and on about armour. And my entire childhood I was making mock-ups of bits of armour, using anything I could, papier-mâché, cardboard, all kinds of stuff. And when I got into my teenage years, I did actually start some metalworking. I did make some reasonably okay, actually, replica of the Visby gauntlets, and this kind of stuff. And I did make bits and pieces. I made a buckler, which I've actually still got somewhere. So I did learn rudimentary armouring skills, but it's a tough skill. You either throw everything into armour making, or you don't, and you don't go anywhere with it. It's a very time consuming, and to learn the skill to become a proper armourer is insanely difficult. Okay, that's why there's very few armourers around and why armour's very expensive. Not just because there aren't that many people buying it, but it takes a long time to make and is very physically demanding and physically difficult. And I think you need a degree of artistic talent as well to make armour that looks right. So I was obsessed with armour. Going back to the original question, of when did it start, I honestly don't know, but I think it was probably watching TVs and movies. And you know, I was very lucky. I grew up in a family that was relatively interested in history and took me to castles and took me to stately homes and things like this, and so I was able to absorb some of the culture and some of the history, the real stuff, yeah, and I think there's a few other things that happened in my childhood which also influenced me to a small degree. I remember my great uncle, for example, who was in the Royal Navy, but working for NATO in the United States at the time. And I remember him coming to visit from I think he was living in Florida or Virginia at the time. He came to visit to visit Wilkinson's sword, to pick up his new dress sword, and I think that probably had an influence on me. The fact that there's still people making swords, there's still people wearing swords. That's amazing. And you know, also I saw reenactments at quite a young age, became quite aware of the fact that there were people out there learning how to sword fight and do stuff like this. I managed to take up fencing at school, modern fencing, at the age of 16. I never did it to a high level, to competition level. I didn't really have the opportunity to, actually, but I did carry on fencing at university recreationally. But because I discovered HEMA at a fairly young age, at 19, I kind of already got diverted in the historical direction before I ever really went deep into the modern fencing direction. So there we go. There's a brief insight into, and before I go, I have to mention archery. So my dominant sport, despite the fact I'm known for swords and known for fencing, my dominant activity as a teenager was archery. So I took up archery at age 11. I wanted to be Robin Hood. I competed at junior level for my London Borough and my club. Did quite well, won a bunch of medals at junior level. I was pretty good at modern recurve. But by age 16, I'd managed to save up money to buy my first longbow. And then it was like, goodbye modern archery. So a little bit similar to how I was with swords. Goodbye modern fencing, throw myself into historical fencing. I was the same with archery. And so from age 16 to about 21, I was very avid longbow archer. And then, you know, life and girlfriends and partying and stuff took over, and somehow archery fell by the wayside. I still do a bit of archery, but I'm not a regular archer anymore. And the other thing that I would also mention is that Archery is a great fit if you're interested in medieval stuff. HEMA at the moment is quite difficult to get into as a teenager because of the legal restrictions, certainly in the UK. If you're teaching kids, obviously you need to be checked. It used to be CRB, it's called something else, checked now, which is fine. I think most people can do that. But the problem is the insurance, and most insurance that we have only covers 16-year-olds upwards. So it's quite difficult if you're a kid, if you're under 16 and you want to get into HEMA. But I always recommend do some sport fencing. Doesn't matter if it's not what you ultimately want to do. If what you ultimately want to do is military sabre or rapier or longsword or something else, modern sport fencing will give you a basis for that. And I still teach things in my classes, whether it's longsword or sabre, which come from what I was taught in foil and sabre, okay, back in modern fencing. But also archery is a great thing because you can get into archery at any age, and it's a good fun activity, and it's a skill you never really lose. Yeah, you get slightly worse if you don't practice, but you can still pick up a bow and shoot arrows at a target. So it's a bit like learning to ride a bike, as we would say. So there we go, there's a little insight into what got me into it. But you know, I generally say to people when they ask me what got you into this, I'm like, I don't know, because I've been into it for as long as I can possibly remember. I have loved swords and bows and armour and ancient and medieval and Renaissance and now, you know, 19th century history. I've loved that going as far back as I can remember, definitely under the age of 5. So there we go. Hope that's somewhat interesting, a bit indulgent and narcissistic of me to talk about myself, but I was asked. And you know, if you're passionate about these things, then hopefully my channel helps a little bit with that. But do try and get involved with some activity, even if it's not precisely what you want to do now. Try and find something, because nothing that you do now is useless to you in the future. If you do kendo or judo or BJJ or wrestling or modern fencing or archery or rifle shooting or whatever, if you're interested in historical combat and you're interested in historical weapons, any of these sorts of things that you can find near you, probably, unless you live literally in the middle of nowhere, any of these things will be useful to you, whatever you do in the future. Anyway, cheers for watching, folks. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe. We have extra videos on Patreon, and you can follow us on Facebook.